All right. So welcome everyone, especially our special guest, Professor Ashley Dawson from the City University of New York. At the moment, it is 4 p.m. and quite dark and cold here in Helsinki. How are things in New York?
It's morning time, 9 a.m. We actually just had a big storm last night, the second storm in about 2 weeks. Luckily, there wasn't too much flooding from this one. The last big storm, was so exemplary of the challenges we face. It dumped about an inch of rain on the city for about 6 hours or something like that, and it flooded a lot of people's homes and actually killed about 14 people in the city who are living in these basement apartments. So the kind of conjunction of poverty and climate crisis has been very much in evidence in New York City, even in the last couple of weeks.
All right, sounds really tough. We haven't had that kind of storms here yet, but it has just been on the news that actually Finland is not so well prepared precisely like events like that. So let's see, a couple of years from here or a decade from here. All right, so some basics of tonight's or today's event. The event is arranged by the multidisciplinary BIOS research unit based in Helsinki, Finland. It is part of the series of BIOS events in the Helsinki Biennial, which is arranged for the first time this summer on the beautiful island of Vallisaari in Helsinki. You can almost see it from our office here, but not quite. There's cars blocking the view. BIOS was invited by the Biennial to build a research station on the island. Ours operates in a different way than normal research stations. The focus is not on studying the local context, but rather we bring and synthesize research from all over the world to the island. And in today's event, we get an update on the contemporary struggles against fossil capitalism and for a democratic energy transition in the US. Professor Dawson presents his observations about the obstacles encountered by movements in the US and discusses the role of art in these mobilizations. Dawson has been active in the civic debate on overcoming the intertwined environmental and social crises, and in his latest book, People's Power, published by OR Books, Dawson sets out what is required to give up on fossil fuels and dismantle the exploitative structures of capitalism and the state. We first hear Ashley's presentation, and then we have plenty of time for discussions. So all of you in the audience, you're welcome to take part in ways that you prefer. With me from BIOS, I'm Paavo Järvensivu. There's Karoliina Lummaa, and then there's Tere Vadén over there, and there's also Saara Karhunen from the Biennial. If you wanna show the video or not, your choice. Hi. And then we might be joined by other BIOS members and get some new audience members. Who knows? But welcome all, good to have you here, and the virtual stage is yours, Ashley.
Okay, thank you so much, Paavo, for that introduction, and thank you to you and your colleagues for inviting me to be part of the biennial and to be in dialogue with you, learning from one another and establishing forms of solidarity, I think is so important in the current context. And I particularly value it as someone who lives in the kind of belly of the fossil capitalist imperial beast. You know, it's often hard for people living in the US to have a perspective on struggles elsewhere and to feel empowered because the obstacles to progress here are so high. So with that said, I'm going to give a bit of a portrait of the fight against fossil capitalism here in New York. I live in New York City, in the borough of Queens specifically, and I teach in the City University of New York. And I've been part of the public power campaign here in the city and in the state of New York. So I'm going to talk about that campaign. And it's important for folks who aren't in the US to realize that the public power campaign here in New York has been held up as a kind of potential model for a national Green New Deal in the electricity sector. So what's happening in New York, which of course is the biggest city and one of the real centers for capital in the country and of course in the world, is something that's very, very important. So I think as we struggle, we're very aware that what we're doing here has ramifications far beyond this particular city and state. And the key kind of question we've been trying to tackle is, how do we win democratic decarbonization? Is it even possible to win democratic decarbonization given the current context? I mean, the wager of the Green New Deal is essentially to establish some form of social democracy. In other words, to be able to make quick transition in energy and many other fronts towards a more sustainable society. And in doing so, to create a lot of good jobs and to do that through the electoral process, through government. And we're really in a kind of critical period right now where, you know, Biden has been elected. We've got a whole series of different proposals that are being discussed in Congress, and their fate is not quite clear yet. So what's happened here in New York State, I think, is also quite interesting in terms of understanding what the possibilities and the obstacles are more broadly in the United States. So I'm going to talk first of all about investor-owned utilities and give folks a bit of a background on investor-owned utilities. Then I'm going to talk about blockadia struggles in the city. Blockadia is the term that Naomi Klein and others have used to talk about efforts to block the construction of new fossil fuel infrastructure. Then I'll talk briefly about the public power campaign, and I'll talk about, along the way, I'll talk about some forms of visual art and other forms of cultural expression, which are part of the struggle. And I'll kind of conclude by talking about some important historical precedents for our struggle. Okay, so it's important to know that in the United States, most people receive their energy from investor-owned energy utilities. In other words, these are private utilities, but they're supposed to be regulated by the state. And that's a kind of solution that was achieved in the 1930s in the context of the Great Depression, the New Deal era, and a lot of public mobilization about the corruption of the existing energy providers, and many campaigns to municipalize power and, you know, essentially have democratic power. So I think it's important for us to remember that there's a long history of struggle against kind of privatized for-profit versions of the existing energy system in the United States. And the importance of those alternatives has been really underlined in recent years by a whole series of catastrophes, including something that happened last winter in Texas, when a kind of cold snap, a polar vortex came down from northern parts of the country and plunged Texas into sub-zero temperatures for weeks on end. And the electric grid, which had gone through over a decade of deregulation and intensive privatization wasn't able to cope with this and crashed. And in fact, my parents live in the capital of the state, Austin, Texas, and had to survive without any electricity, without any heat for many days on end. And it was a very terrifying period. I mean, my parents are relatively affluent, and yet it wasn't clear for a number of days whether or not they were going to be able to survive. So it was a terrifying period, and of course it affected people with less means far more seriously. And so it really underlined how the existing investor-owned utilities are not capable of dealing with the current crisis. In addition to that, what's happened is that the investor-owned utilities that provide most of the energy in this country have shifted away from coal-fired power towards so-called natural gas. And I have a presentation that I'd like to share with people. So I guess I'll have to try and do share screen. Let's see if that will work. Yeah. And I have some slides to show you. Okay, can everyone see? Pavo, you can see? Great, okay.
Yes.
So, thank you. So this gives you a bit of a sense. The bright orange is natural gas. So you can see the extent to which natural gas is quite prevalent in different parts of the country, including in my own state of New York. And across the country, this is true, with about 40% of power provided by natural gas, and roughly another 20% provided by nuclear, almost 20% provided by coal. So renewable energy sources really are a pretty small portion of the amount of energy being generated across the country. And most investor-owned utilities are based in particular states. So these percentages vary from state to state. If I go back up again for a second, you'll see that up at the very top on the right-hand side, Vermont has really serious hydroelectric and wind and other renewable energy quotients. It has basically no natural gas, whereas a state like Delaware is 92% natural gas. So things do differ from state to state, but the overall picture is one of the grid shifting towards natural gas. Essentially, investor-owned utilities have embraced the idea that natural gas is a so-called kind of bridge fuel. And of course, we know that that's not true, and that natural gas emits really serious quantities of greenhouse gas, and that we need to shift away from natural gas burning as quickly as possible. So that's another huge problem with the investor-owned utilities, not only that they have kind of stranded assets in terms of building power plants to build natural gas, but they're very much invested in this kind of ideological idea that natural gas is a bridge fuel. And they have been fighting through spending significant amounts of money against a shift towards renewables like solar and wind. Now, what's been happening in terms of fighting against that natural gas infrastructure? Because it's not as if it's all, the build out is all finished. It continues that build out. And in New York City and surrounding states, we are in a particularly kind of strategic place because we are quite close to the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, which is one of the major sources for frack gas and places where fracking takes place. And of course, the Eastern Seaboard, where New York is a concentration of massive numbers of people in the country. So what we have been seeing is the continuing construction of pipelines to bring the natural gas from Pennsylvania, where it's unearthed, and to transport it to New York City, to Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and other cities in the Eastern Seaboard. And so we have a very strong Blockadia movement. Often Blockadia is thought of as something that happens in rural areas. And of course, there's a really important struggle going on right now in rural parts of Minnesota against a tar sands pipeline, the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. But what I think is important to understand is that Blockadia is also very much an urban phenomenon. And so I'm going to talk about the struggle against North Brooklyn Pipeline, which is going into a borough just south of me, a part of New York City just south of me. And it's being constructed through a community which is predominantly people of color, working class, and low-income people. So this is a community that's already burdened with all sorts of forms of toxicity, whether it's waste transfer stations, that means that you have lots of garbage trucks driving through that emit lots of fumes, or incinerators and many other toxic forms of infrastructure. And as a result of that, these communities already have high levels of environmentally related diseases such as asthma and heart disease. And so, you know, the community has mobilized against the construction of yet more fossil capitalist infrastructure, and specifically against this North Brooklyn pipeline. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the ways in which visual art has played an important role in this struggle. I'll talk specifically about posters and the posters that have been used as part of the campaign against the North Brooklyn pipeline, and then also about the links between these posters and the kind of iconography of the posters and the forms of actual protests that have taken place on the ground, and the ways that that kind of iconography translates into popular protest that is almost a form of performance art, I would argue. You know, it's kind of connected to a long lineage of performance art in New York City and elsewhere. All right, so let me share my screen again quickly, and I will show you some of these images. Okay, so this is the North Brooklyn fracked gas pipeline struggle that I'm talking about. And here's one image. This is a poster that says, "We are not a sacrifice zone." It identifies the company, National Grid, that is building a fracked gas pipeline through the area of Brooklyn. Incidentally, National Gas is a British company, but it has many divisions here in the United States, including in New York City, that provide natural gas to consumers and businesses. And I think the other thing that's kind of important is that there's a connection here being made between climate justice, racial justice, and the Black Lives Matter struggle, which of course led to massive mobilizations in New York City over the last year and across the United States. And so I think making those connections, which this poster does, is so really important. And I think the images are interesting, right? We have a picture of the city with the kind of famous grid structure of New York. And then laid on top of it is an image of a woman wearing a mask and putting her her arm up into the air in a symbol of power, but also in a gesture that I think sort of recalls the Statue of Liberty on some level, right? So, and the dialogue box, which shows that she's speaking, shows that she and her family came to the United States as immigrants from Tibet. And we see a kind of mountain right next to her to reference her homeland or her family's homeland. So this kind of idea of the United States as a place of refuge for immigrants, but then the huge clash with that, which the pollution of neighborhoods of color constitutes. And this idea of a sacrifice zone, I think, summarizes that and is very important, right? The notion that some people and the places that they live in can be set aside and can suffer the consequences, which the rest of the country benefits from in terms of fossil capitalist infrastructure or the extraction of fuels is something that this struggle is referencing and very much using to sort of help summarize their acts of refusal. Here's another image. This one, again, picking up on the idea of the sacrifice zone. There's a circle that's evidently made out of pipes, so referencing the pipeline, and it says there is no acceptable sacrifice zone. And inside that circle is an image of a young woman who seems to be of African or Latinx background, and she's holding a sign that says "No North Brooklyn Frack Gas Pipeline." And she seems to be wearing some kind of a dress, but what's really interesting about this image is that the dress and two kind of projections on either side of her head make the international hazardous symbols or hazardous waste symbol. So there's a kind of very interesting sign here of the way in which frack gas is hazardous. And in fact, research that has been done in recent years has shown that frack gas contains significant quantities of nuclear radioactive elements like radium, so that workers who are involved in putting the pipelines in place often end up suffering from all sorts of diseases. And of course, the pipelines are hazardous to the community in which they're based. And this is a really important image, not only in terms of mobilizing the community, but in terms of calling for solidarity between the community and the workers who work for National Grid and other fossil capitalist companies. Winning the struggle for public power is going to mean mobilizing many different sectors, including the union sector here in New York City and New York State. And so being able to make these kinds of connections and build solidarity is a really key part of the struggle. In this next image, there is an image of people locked into their houses during the pandemic. And while they're cloistered in that way, the company, National Grid, has workers out who are laying the pipeline in place. And the kind of major dominating image within this woodblock print is a corporate executive wearing a hard hat. And he, instead of having a normal face, has a skull. And so obviously there's a kind of reference there to the destructive impact of the pipeline and of fossil capitalism in general. But I think it's also a quite clever reference to the tradition of kind of revolutionary art making in Mexico, specifically to the work of the lithographer Jose Posada, and the way that he depicted the bourgeoisie as these sort of skeletons who were pursuing their own profits and killing others in the course of doing so. So I think this image is really, really powerful in indicting the company and in challenging fossil capitalism. I have just a couple more images to share with people. This one is, again, mobilizing people to fight against the pipeline and says you can't quarantine climate change. So the pandemic context is again evident here. What I think is very interesting about this image is that it features what is evidently a pipeline going through different neighborhoods in North Brooklyn, like Williamsburg and Bushwick and Greenpoint. But the pipeline also turns into a snake. And this image of the black snake is one that is absolutely central to blockadia movements in the United States. Here's an image from the 2016 mobilization against the Dakota Access Pipeline with a quotation from LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, one of the indigenous water protectors who helped to organize the protests against the DAPL pipeline. And she says, "We came to fight a black snake until it's dead." And of course, she's referencing here indigenous religious traditions and the kind of prophecy of a black snake coming to pollute the land, which is over 100 years old and which helped to really mobilize people against the DAPL pipeline. So we see this kind of image of the black snake recurring in the struggle against the pipeline in North Brooklyn. And what I think that testifies to is the sense of solidarity between people fighting in an urban context against fossil capitalism and people in rural areas, indigenous people fighting against new fossil infrastructure in those areas. Here's a photograph that I took at one of the demonstrations. This was mainly bike-based. We biked from portion to portion of the community, and there were speak outs in front of particularly important sites. In this case, this was a speak out in front of a branch of Chase Bank, which is one of the major funders for a lot of pipeline infrastructure in North America, including for the North Brooklyn pipeline. And you can see again there the sort of image of the pipeline, the image of the snake. And the speaker here is a Native American woman who had recently been arrested at the Line 3 protest in Minnesota. So again, there's this very palpable and strong sense of connection between struggles in New York City in an urban context and struggles in more rural areas between people of color marginalized in the city and indigenous people in their territories in the United States. Okay, so I will briefly stop the images and just talk a little bit about public power and the public power campaign. If Blockadia is about resisting new fossil capitalist infrastructure, the public power campaign is based on the recognition that we can't just say no, we have to have a yes, we have to have an alternative. And in the case of the public power campaign, that alternative is to push for democratic renewable energy, democratically controlled renewable energy, and a very fast transition away from fossil capitalist forms of energy, and specifically natural gas. So the campaign was founded 2 years ago in New York City. It began as a campaign against increasing rates that the energy utilities were charging everyday people for their energy, and it was really bringing to light the kind of issues of energy poverty and inequality built into the system. But very quickly, it developed into a campaign for something different. And that had to do with some natural disasters that happened here and with the malfeasance of the investor-owned utilities. So there was a period of extreme heat in the summer of 2020, and the investor-owned utility, Con Ed it's called, shut down power to parts of the city. Which parts of the city? Well, surprise, surprise, to poor parts of the city, parts of the city that were predominantly populated by people of color. And of course, it's precisely those parts of the city that are most vulnerable to the urban heat island effect. You know, those are the parts of the city that have the fewest trees, the most concrete, the least access to public cooling facilities like public libraries or other social centers. And so people are highly dependent on, individual air conditioners, particularly elderly people and children. And so when the utility cuts power off to those areas, it really is building on other forms of extreme oppression and environmental injustice. So those events help to really mobilize people, including some progressive politicians, behind a campaign to create a new public authority, which would be in charge of a really rapid shift to renewable energy, and which would have a new democratic governance structure. So the Public Power Campaign has essentially spent the last 2 years putting together a couple of bills, which we hope would become law in the New York State legislature, to mandate these shifts, to create a new power authority, to mandate that it be 100% renewable energy and really build out genuine modern renewables like solar and wind power. And that it have a democratic governance structure. And of course, just like the Green New Deal nationally, the promise was that many new jobs would be brought to the state through the creation of this authority. And again, to give you a sense of why this is so necessary, New York City has under 5% renewable energy, genuinely renewable energy, that is solar and wind power. As an individual consumer, you can opt into getting hydropower, which comes from upstate, from the Great Lakes region. And so you can have clean power, but it costs more. So again, issues of energy poverty come up. The campaign has done very well ideologically. It's really shifted the discussion. And in the last legislative session, last winter and spring, we got over 60 legislators to sign on in support and to co-sponsor these bills that we put forward, but ultimately they didn't pass. And we've been doing we've been spending time over the summer analyzing why that happened. And it had to do, we've discovered, with money being given to legislators, particularly legislators controlling key committees like the Energy Committee in the state legislature, from the investor-owned utilities. So when I said earlier that the investor-owned utilities were fighting against renewable energy, this is just one kind of example of how they're corrupting the political system. Now, going forward, we obviously need to call out that corruption, to put individual legislators on watch that we're going to campaign against them, particularly legislators who are based in the city and who represent communities that are so affected by environmental injustices, such as the heat island effect. And we also, as I said, need to organize with labor unions to make sure that labor unions realize that it's in their interest to fight for energy transition. And there's a lot of, it's a big challenge to get energy union, the unions representing energy workers on board. And I can talk a little bit more about that during discussion if you all would like. I'll close out my presentation by talking a little bit about the idea of public power, the need to kind of think about energy as a commons, and to see that our struggle is not just about putting laws forward, but that it's a much broader mobilization that has to involve kind of extra parliamentary efforts, has to involve education, and that's why art is so important, and has to really shift people's consciousness so that they stop thinking about energy as something that is given to them, so they sit passively waiting for the energy to arrive from an investor-owned utility, from these utilities that are essentially making money for wealthy investors, and to see energy as something that by all rights is something that belongs to them. They should have a stake in controlling and making decisions about. So this is a kind of struggle that some energy democracy activists have called an in, against, and beyond the state struggle, right? So we can't just think of kind of winning over legislators and doing everything we need that way. We have to also be doing all kinds of social mobilizations. And I think that's why it's so important that we have these powerful blockadia movements in the city, because those movements are also involved in the struggle for public power. And I want to conclude by talking briefly about what the precedents for this struggle in the United States are. And to do that, I'm going to take us back to the New Deal era and share a couple of images from that period. So this is the image from the Public Power Campaign, Public Utilities Under Public Control, which again references a lot of the images of the New Deal era, the kind of raised fist controlling the lightning bolt of electricity. But then if we go back to posters that were created during the 1930s, this is a poster that was made in the context of the Rural Electrification Administration. Basically, there was a recognition in the 1930s that people in the countryside in the United States did not have access to electricity because it wasn't in the interest of the investor-owned utilities, the same investor-owned utilities that we have today, and their profit model to string wires out to isolated rural areas. You know, they were located in urban markets where they could make a lot of money through energy generation and diffusion. So what the New Deal administration of Franklin Roosevelt did was to create this Rural Electrification Administration and to give low interest loans to co-ops in rural areas. And so you have this language on the bottom of the poster: co-ops are member owned and controlled. And I think this is a really interesting kind of rhetoric because it involves a form of grassroots democracy, right, where people are actually controlling the way that energy is provided to them. And it's also getting around some of the accusations which were prominent at the time and which unfortunately remain very prominent in the United States of kind of socialism, of, you know, overweening state control, right? So this idea of new members, new owners, right, being able to control your energy and have a stake in your energy was really important. But of course, this was actually a form of socialism, right? Because the government was providing the loans to set up these co-ops. And so this history is really important in understanding what a kind of cooperative-based democratic structure might look like in the United States today. And of course, there are many solar co-ops proliferating around the United States today, but also in terms of thinking how we might make sure that a kind of state-oriented administration, like the one we've been trying to set up with the Public Power Campaign, could be democratically controlled. At the time, there were also efforts to shift people's consciousness. So the Federal Theater Project, which was set up as part of the New Deal Works Progress Administration, the WPA, basically provided money for unemployed writers and journalists. And as part of that project, a play was written called Power, which drew on headlines about the corruption of the investor-owned utilities and created a whole kind of performance which helped to disseminate knowledge of corruption of these entities and to show people what the public alternatives might be. And this entity, the Federal Theater Project, was suppressed in 1939, 2 years after the play Power had been created, and after it had been performed, not just in New York, but all around the country. So, you know, the kind of incendiary impact of this work was quite apparent to people on the right, and they did their best to shut it down. So I think that really testifies to the power of not just visual art, but also forms of dramatic art in spreading the word about alternative possibilities. And the image that I'll close with is one that comes from the immediate post-war period. This is an advertising image for a washing machine. And what I think it testifies to is the way in which a very kind of repressive model of domestic femininity was being put in place for middle-class white people, and the ways in which electrification were being held up as something that would be emancipatory for these middle-class women through automation. And of course, all of this suggested that the way to freedom was not through collective control of social reproduction, but rather through individual kind of domestic consumption. So I would say that as we fight right now for democratic and collective control of our energy system, we need to be very aware of the ways in which struggles in the past got reappropriated by capitalist interests, and to make sure that that doesn't happen again. So that's where I'll stop. Thank you all very much for listening, and I would love to hear from all of you questions or observations about what, if anything, resonated from the struggles that we're engaged in here in New York and in the US more broadly.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I think that was really interesting on many different levels.
Thank you.
Somehow, I would like to first point at kind of the difference, or what was kind of immediately felt central to me is the difference that here the struggles we have, they don't actually relate to the toxicity or health issues of the fossil fuel infrastructure. So I think the image here is actually quite clean, that it works, and and the people working for the infrastructure, they are actually paid quite well, and so forth. So so basically in some sense the only argument against the fossil infrastructure is that it causes climate change, and actually we don't see those. We are kind of in some sense one of the last places where you actually feel the kind of hardest impacts of climate change. So in those respects, I feel that kind of the argumentation and fighting over these issues, it has a really different basis.
That's really interesting. I'm surprised to hear that, because the struggle here it's so palpable. We have many power plants that are located in the city, and the communities surrounding those power plants have higher levels of asthma and other diseases that are directly linked to the emissions of those power plants. One phenomenon that is particularly worrying is that we have a nuclear power plant about 10 miles north of New York City called Indian Point. There have been long struggles to shut it down because it's past the point that it was supposed to be decommissioned, and actually finally the reactors were all shut down last spring. But what that means is that there's suddenly a hole of about 20% of the power that was being generated for the city. And the response of politicians is to set up more so-called peaker plants. These are very dirty plants that go online during moments of peak demand, like for instance, in the summer when it's hot, when people want to turn their air conditioners on. And all of those peaker plants are located in communities of color that, suffer this kind of disproportionate burden of toxicity in the city. So I'm so interested and also surprised to hear that there isn't this kind of sense of, palpable outrage over the location of fossil fuel infrastructure in cities there in Finland.
Yeah, it's almost literally behind the corner. There's a coal plant, and it's well, it's regarded as quite a beautiful sight. In some sense, it's the kind of
does it have a ski slope on top of it or something like that?
There's some nice lighting besides the black hole. Well, anyways, I think that the kind of what the kind of Extinction Rebellion called Elokapina here, for instance, I think it's more about the kind of that people cannot, especially younger people, cannot see a future for themselves, and they cannot see jobs where they could actually build a future rather than destroy their own future and so on. They are not learning skills that they feel that they need to build a brighter future and so on. And this is of course kind of a moral and like a very dissonant feeling, like kind of I think kind of overpowering like an existential feeling that there is. But it's built like that, I would say. So there's this like planetary threat that is felt, not like a local threat in some sense. I also noticed that there's a couple of other BIOS people have joined Antti Majava and Jussi Eronen, and perhaps Antti, if you have been listening and you'd like to raise the issue of struggles in Kainuu, you could do that in a while, but I noticed that Carolina put on your video. Do you want to?
Yeah, I was glad to hear you, Paavo, to point out the question of different generations. And by the way, of course, thank you, Ashley, for your presentation. I think it was very good and very important to see how things are experienced and thought of in a place completely different from Finland, as we have been talking about already. And I was thinking that wondering about the difference between generations, because I think that in Finland, at least, and this is one of the reasons why perhaps the fossil industry is not experienced as so hazardous as in the States, for example. That it's been dealt with care in here, and you cannot see all the difficulties that Paavo was pointing to. And of course, Finland is also not so densely populated. That can be one reason. But I was also thinking about the difference between generations, that younger generations seem to experience the threat and the problems more directly than perhaps the older generations, who are getting used to all the nice things that the older ways of doing things have been providing them with. And I was wondering that what is the situation in the States when you are talking about these power struggle movements? Are they particularly more about the young people protesting, or is there some kind of gap between the generations?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. It's definitely true that there's a lot of mobilization and a lot of anger among young people about the destruction of their futures here in the United States. I'm sure many of you all know about the Sunrise Movement, which is a movement comprised of young people. Probably most famously, they were holding a sit-in in Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, offices in Washington, D.C., and newly elected Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez went there to express her solidarity. So, you know, I think there's this movement of young people, and there are some legislators like AOC who, of course, drafted a version of the Green New Deal and circulated it, who are very much aware of these issues, very angry, and are the protagonists in putting forward alternatives. And, you know, I've been part of big demonstrations before the pandemic linked to the Fridays for the Future protests. So there was mass participation. It wasn't just in terms of individual, you know, radical legislators or social, like organized NGOs, but there was also a real mass movement here in the United States, just as there has been in Europe and all over the world. You know, unfortunately, the pandemic pretty much shut that down. And so the real question I think that confronts us now is kind of, as, you know, one hopes, you know, if we get over the forms of kind of shutdown of public space that have been associated with the pandemic, how will these movements regroup and mobilize, and what will their orientation really be? Because, of course, the pandemic offered us a kind of sliver of hope for a little while when all the airplanes stopped flying and people stopped driving in cities, and we got to reclaim the streets. And of course, there were these massive Black Lives Matter mobilizations. And as I said, in the United States, people have been very aware of the links between Black Lives Matter and kind of the abolition movement, abolition of prisons and police, and climate justice struggles, which I think is something that really gives a lot of energy to the movement here. Yeah, how will these movements mobilize again as we move out of this period of the pandemic? But what I should say really makes the US different from a place like Finland, I think, or maybe I should phrase this as a question. Does it make it different? Certainly a huge dynamic here in the US is race, right? So, you know, the kind of environmental injustices that I was alluding to before and throughout my presentation are always racialized, always build on a history of racial inequality. Policies like redlining, which meant that banks weren't lending money to people of color to live in neighborhoods that had better infrastructure, essentially consigning them to racialized ghettos, right? So that long history resonates very much in the present and is very much animating the struggle against fossil capitalism. And so, you know, in addition to the kind of noxiousness of like locally based infrastructural elements like the peaker plants that I mentioned before, what's really at stake is people's awareness of these long histories of racism and colonialism. In other words, kind of settler colonialism and racial capitalism. And these are not just kind of academic terms here in the United States. You know, if you go on one of the protests, like the ones that I showed one photograph of, you have community members talking about colonialism, you know, talking about not just the fossil capitalist stuff in their streets, but talking about gentrification and how they're being pushed out of their neighborhoods, how that's linked to histories of colonialism, talking about how their kids can't learn their languages in school and so are being kind of mentally colonized, right? So this kind of anger at these histories that are deeply kind of culturally sedimented is really kind of key to the struggles that are going on today. And of course, you know, these movements know that they have alternative lifeways, right? You know, that they come out of traditions that can give us a sense of different ways of being in relation to the world that are very different from the values of capitalist society and neoliberalism. So yeah, it's anger against these forms of racism and colonialism, and also a sense, you know, we have alternatives and we're going to fight for them. That is, I would say, one of the really kind of key dynamics here in the US, and it's a powerful one. And I don't know what extent that's something that is at play in Finland, but it's definitely powerful here.
I see Jussi raised his hands. He can perhaps also comment on the colonial aspects here, if you will.
Yeah, the one point about that I mentioned now before I forget about the grid and electrification, that actually pretty similar to how the electrification of northern Finland happened. So there was a kind of like regional energy companies. They were not completely co-owned, but there was co-ownership included, and they offered they offered possibility to join the co-op in order to get the electric line drawn into a certain rural outlets. And there was also this kind of dynamic that it was mostly women and workers who would have liked to have the electricity, but the ones who decided were usually the men, who didn't actually understand how much that would help for the kind of like household chores, because they were usually many times outside working away from home. So they didn't actually understand the kind of dynamic, and that's actually quite interesting history there that hasn't been really well studied, but there are possibilities, and that is also connected to this colonialism that Paavo mentioned, that we have the Sami people in the north, and the kind of like the colonialism is discussion is alive there. So it's the northern part of Finland where it's now quite lively. Also northern Norway, Sweden, part of Russia, and it's that they are much more environmentally aware, but situation is slightly difficult in a way because they've become so much part of Finnish society. Like 2/3 of the Sami people actually live in Helsinki. So they are kind of like, although they are many times mentally thought as being part of the northern latitudes and living in the Lapland, but most of them actually live in Helsinki, and you can't really recognize them from the outset. And then the kind of like traditional livelihoods like reindeer herding, fishing, those are not restricted in Finland to ethnicity. So anybody can become a reindeer herder. That's different in, for example, Norway, where you have to have an ethnic background in order to be allowed to keep reindeer. So there are these kind of tensions that in Finnish case make it much more complex, the situation. And there are different discussions about this. And on the other hand, they are really keen on being able to sustain their livelihoods and use the resources. And sometimes that's not in the face of climate change and biodiversity change. It's not easy because the amount of reindeer in ground are sometimes too many. The actual they are change the landscape, but on the other hand, it's really hard to restrict those rights. So it's kind of like this kind of dynamic, which is slightly different from US, where it's much more concentrated on race and on kind of like land ownership, who can actually use lands. Here it's also part of the discussion, but it's much more complex because they are much more ingrained in the society, and changes are in that sense harder to depict, and the discussions easily become entangled in other parts. Now Antti can probably
continue. That's fascinating. Thank you, Jussi, for some of that background. I mean, one of the things that I know my presentation wasn't really about this, but you know, in being part of some of the counter summits at the Conference of Parties, United Nations mobilizations, what has been really fascinating is to see the extent to which US-based organizations like the Indigenous Environmental Network have been connecting with kind of trans-hemispheric and even beyond sort of indigenous networks. So, you know, I think the kind of indigenous activism that has been so central to Blockadia in Canada and the United States is also very much connected by a sense of solidarity with what's happening to indigenous people in other parts of the world, particularly people who are on the front lines of extractivism. So yeah, that I don't know to what extent that's part of Sami awareness and struggle, but I think it's a really important thing to kind of be aware of, and of course to be inspired by, right? That kind of sense of drawing on forms of solidarity that go beyond your individual and specific geographical location, with a kind of broader network of people fighting against injustice.
Yeah, the extractivism is really kind of a current now in northern Finland, because there's multiple different possibilities to extract, especially the rare earth minerals that you need for the battery industry and so on, and those are many times clashing with tourism and the indigenous livelihoods. So it's a really topical discussion now, but it's slightly different from what we have been discussing here.
I would add that despite these clashes that Jussi brought up, the discussions are still somewhat separated in Finland, so we don't relate these colonial issues and the fights against fossil capitalism so much together. I wouldn't see that they build energy to the movement in a way together, but rather are still kept as separate things.
Yeah, I should be clear that I'm not talking about the environmental movement in general. You know, the snapshot I have been giving you is of a fairly radical segment of the movement. And, you know, one of the enduring big struggles is to add a kind of anti-racist, anti-colonial element to mainstream environmentalism in the US. You know, so I have friends of color who are like on the board of big organizations in the US, and they're like the only person, and they feel tokenized, and there isn't the same kind of consciousness of climate justice and the need for reparations to global South countries as part of the climate struggle, for instance. So, you know, I think it's something that is an issue everywhere. It's not an easy kind of connection. And because of that, I think a lot of communities of color often bridle against environmentalism. You know, they see environmentalism as a kind of white middle class movement that doesn't really have their own interests in heart. So the kinds of alignments and solidarities that I was talking about in my presentation are the result of really hard work on the part of activists in overcoming some of those barriers to create really meaningful forms of solidarity.
Thanks. Carolina, did you have something, or do we give the floor to Antti?
Sorry, yes, let's give floor to Antti.
All right, Antti, go.
Okay, yeah, here I am. Greetings from Hyrssalmi. I'm indeed Finnish countryside right now, and I'm very thankful for the presentation. It was very interesting and gave lots of points of views to my work, not only here in this local community, but also in Helsinki. And I think that what I would like to bring to the conversation is that we actually have pretty widespread consensus in Finland for getting rid of fossil fuels in all forms. And I think that that's easy for Finland because we don't have any own resources, and that's all imported mainly from Russia. But we also are great refining. We have a very like a remarkable refining industry which is specialized into this fossil or like Russian crude oil resources, which are quite special, and they need special treatment to be refined into high quality fuels. So our energy dependency on Russia is one quite interesting issue. Another issue is that actually when we are quite like much sharing the idea that we would like to get rid of it's maybe 60% of our energy, overall usage of energy is still fossil based. So what it really means is that it brings the energy production and the energy resources here. Like we have just both, we have been clever enough to produce economic resources to buy energy from Russia, but now we have to do that on our own land. And what we have been doing now, or what is the main kind of line in this transition from fossil fuels to so-called renewable energy sources, is that we for a long time we had this idea to replace the fossil sources with bioresources, mainly forest-based energy, and that's very bad idea when it comes to the in emissions, mainly because it actually increases the emissions to the climate instead of decreasing them. And then it raises a little bit the same question, what is also the biggest issue related to wind power, which is actually the most promising, not only promising, but it's very much used also in Finland all the time. And we have big projects here in Hyrssalmi as well, which I'm working with right now. But the basic idea is that actually there hasn't been any need for putting any land into energy production, or hardly any infrastructure we have seen in Finland until now related to energy production. And now we are just in the beginning to understand how much land actually we need for these windmills. We need thousands of windmills all over. And Finland is not very, our population density is not very high. So this is thought to be the most promising opportunity for the German wind power companies. When they are struggling pretty much, they can't actually build much more wind power in Germany. So they are very much looking forward to build up that capacity or the future capacities in Finland. And then Finland is aiming to become a hydrogen superpower because of that idea that we have enough or like hell lot of like land which can be used by international companies. And no one really understands what that really means, and who will, like the landowners, are they benefiting from this? Are they forced to sell their property, or are they making good contracts like when they are hiring their land for the companies? And this all is like, we are talking about definitely the biggest investments ever seen in this region, and in most of the northern Finland, I would say. We are talking about billions and billions of international money flows heading here, and the lack of intensity in this conversation is phenomenal. No one is really talking about this. Even the local companies they don't know anything about the wind industry, and they don't have any connections to these international companies, and they are hardly benefiting from them or this whole thing. So I'm very pleased to hear the kind of like about the intensity of the conversation you have in US, and we should definitely adapt similar kind of attitudes towards this great transition and things going on. And there's lots of reasons to be critical also towards putting wind power all over, and the equality is the like economical profit equally shared, and how much of that is going to local communities. These are all like very urgent topics, and hopefully we will get this conversation culture and this like discussions a little bit to Finland, what we heard from you. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That's all really fascinating. If I may try and reply just very briefly, I think the dynamics you've pointed to are hugely important, and I think there's a real danger that people can feel kind of colonized by big companies coming from elsewhere, whether they're nationally owned companies or companies, in the case that you're talking about, coming from Germany, where there's not much more land available to a place like Finland. So that can shut down a transition and make people feel very angry. My friend David Hughes is about to publish a book called Who Owns the Wind? It's coming out next month from Verso, that talks about energy transition and wind power in Spain, and why there was such a quick uptake of wind, and then why it stalled out. And his analysis is essentially very similar to what you were talking about, Antti, that communities were initially excited about wind power, but then they didn't have any kind of stake in the turbines that were going up. They would see that their land was being taken over by these huge wind turbines that were owned by companies elsewhere. Most of the energy was being siphoned off to cities, and so they felt thoroughly exploited and colonized, and so they started organizing occupations on the roads to stop the companies coming in and putting up the wind turbines. So you got this kind of popular protest against renewable transition, and I'm sure those of you who have looked at the statistics about Spain know that the kind of transition really did stall out in Spain. And now there are kind of complicated reasons for that, including the EU shift from feed-in tariffs to ways of funding energy that were supposed to be more economical through bidding processes. So there were other factors that slowed the transition or stalled the transition. But I think the feeling that people had of being exploited was hugely important. So I think that's why it's so important to be able to figure out how to think of energy as a commons, and how to put in place mechanisms so that does happen. And I think I did analysis in my book, People's Power, of the process in Germany where feed-in tariffs and support for local collectives in rural areas did give people a feeling that they were benefiting materially from the energy transition. And so I think there are these kinds of histories and alternative models to look at in order to make sure that it's an equitable process, that energy justice and energy democracy aren't just terms being bandied about as we talk about energy transition. And I think that's why these kind of issues of culture that we've been discussing and that I alluded to in my presentation are so important. And particularly the Federal Theater Project that I talked about very, very briefly, that play power, I think that's so important, right? Because it gave people a picture, it helped to educate them about the corruption of the existing energy system. And it was almost like Bertolt Brecht's work, like the Lehrstück, the learning plays that he created in the late 20s and early 30s, where he would essentially set up a problem on the stage and then ask his audiences after the players presented the problem to engage in a kind of dialogue and to thresh through the ideas. And what I think that Federal Theater Project allowed people to do is quite similar, right? So, there was one version of the play based on local headlines in New York, but then when they traveled to other parts of the country, they would adapt what was being presented on the stage to the local circumstances and then engage community members in dialogue. So I think that's one way that the arts and environmental humanities more broadly can play a really important role, not just in sort of disseminating information about energy systems, which we know that one of the kind of fundamental arguments about infrastructure is that it's invisible when it's working well. One of the problems of our energy infrastructure is it's all too often invisible and not working well. So we need to educate people about what's happening and what happens when they flick their light switch on. But going beyond just educating people, it can also engage them in dialogue about alternative possibilities and give them a sense of what a kind of energy commons might look like, allow them to come to their own understandings of that. So I would say that is really, really important in order to make sure that energy transition, which we all know we need for the sake of the climate and the planet, to make sure that people buy into it and feel like they're not just being victimized and exploited by it.
We're actually just today planning something like that to have a kind of a theatrical jazz concert that would educate the people here in Finland, but nothing more about that yet. But it was just so prominently in my mind that I couldn't resist saying that aloud.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
I would say inspiring instead of educating. That's like maybe more nicer way to talk about this.
We cannot say educating here anymore.
But I think it's an important thing to say out loud that art can give us terms and ideas and words to talk about these things and to help people to be more aware of these things. Because as Antti said, I think that we don't have enough discussion about these issues in Finland yet. And it's not just the media that has a role to play. It's also art, I think. And I was so excited to hear your talk, Ashley, because you connected art with fighting or power struggles. And I feel that in Finland, at least, when we are talking about environmental issues or or climate change, art is mostly connected with communicating feelings related to climate change or such things. That art is something individual. It has something to do with feelings or some private experiences. It's not conceptualized as something that can help us think and discuss and struggle or fight over things that are important.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I think the context here is very different. And I didn't talk about this at all in my presentation, but I do have a publication, which I'll share in the chat if people want to take a look at it, which reflects on the struggles around museums that are going on in the United States. Last spring, there was a big movement at the Museum of Modern Art, which of course is one of the most important such institutions in the world. But on the board, there are many people who are climate criminals, you know, who are involved in big investment firms that are mowing down the Amazon and doing many other forms of environmental damage. So what's happened in the United States is that there's been a struggle to get individual bad actors off the boards, the controlling boards of museums like the Whitney, like MoMA, like the Brooklyn Museum, but that struggle is now expanded. And the question is really, what are museums and other powerful cultural institutions like museums, what is their role in the context of the climate emergency, and how do other emergencies circulate through that? So, you know, we know how museums are very much connected to gentrification in places like Brooklyn to all the way to Bilbao, right? You know, so how do museums situate themselves, and to what extent do they allow the voices of the people who are in the front lines into their institutions? You know, they may kind of cherry pick a few elite artists who are doing political work, but to what extent are they really allowing a transformatory political conversation to take place and putting their resources behind that? So, you know, there are many organizations here in the US, from Decolonize This Place to the Natural History Museum, which is not the American Museum of Natural History, but the Natural History Museum, which are sort of asking, what are museums for? What are institutions of culture for? And how can they change orientation? And, you know, I know this is an international movement. There are many groups, for instance, that have been highly critical in the UK about the Tate and the money it's been taking from BP and other fossil capitalist corporations. So yeah, I think that this kind of challenge to culture and to the institutions which propagate culture to really reorient themselves and be part of a struggle against planetary ecocide is a kind of key front right now.
Thanks, Ashley and others. At this point, I remember, since Anne has raised her hand, that I remember to say aloud that please, everyone, raise your hands, or you can comment also, or question in the chat, or however you like. But please, Anne, what did you have in mind?
I would like to comment about this justice in renewable energy, because I think the big division in Finnish society is between people living in the cities, which are the growth areas, and people living in the countryside, which are more and more empty. So I think it would be very important to engage the people living outside the cities to this process. Yes, that's all.
We have the same struggle here in the United States, absolutely. And you know, the effort to make links between people in frontline sacrifice zones where fracking is happening, for instance, and places that are benefiting from fracking, like New York City, and the communities who are being polluted in the city by that fracking is a really, really important one. And another version of that, of course, is how to figure out how to make connections between people in communities that are being polluted by fracking and labor unions, which I alluded to before in my presentation. And that's a very difficult struggle. Many of the labor unions connected to the energy sector are against renewable energy because the jobs in renewable energy don't pay as well, and because they're not unionized. Right. So one of the big obstacles we've found in the struggle for public power is that unions are afraid that if they within the public sector, a lot of the union busting measures, which the Supreme Court in the United States has backed, will mean that they can't go on strike. They can't have their rights to form a union anymore. So making these kinds of connections, whether they're geographical or across different segments of the working class, is hugely important and very, very difficult. So there's a lot of work to be done.
I think there are a lot of kind of, in some sense, artificial struggles, or not struggles, but conflicts between the rural and city areas in Finland. Artificial in the sense that if we would acknowledge the dependencies between the rural and city areas and just figure out ways to build rural communities at the same time as we are lowering carbon emissions and so forth, it wouldn't actually be so difficult. But there are political power plays that put these different people together, and that's really difficult actually to somehow get away from that conflict. We have tried to find new narrative ways and tools to kind of unite those aims, but it's not very easy.
Yeah, no, I mean, here in the United States too, of course, here in the US, rural areas are predominantly white and predominantly Republican and predominantly Trump supporting. So, these are the areas that are against vaccination, and consequently, massive numbers of elderly people in those areas and now increasingly children have been hospitalized and have lost their lives because of their kind of just totally ideological anti-vaccination orientation. So, just in the most immediate way, people are so deeply indoctrinated that they'd rather, die en masse than be willing to accept science and to accept the perspective of their political opponents. And so if that's such an intractable and life and death thing for something like the pandemic and vaccinations, you can imagine how it plays out in terms of fossil fuels and energy transition, right? So yeah, really difficult battles, but ones that are absolutely necessary, particularly like in New York State. What has tended to happen is that fossil capitalist interests have played off New York City against the rural areas upstate, right? And said that if we have some kind of Green New Deal or some kind of public power, it's going to come at the expense of rural people. And so we haven't been able to get the votes together to pass this stuff. So it's not a political battle that we can walk away from, as intractable and difficult as it might be. I'm going to put the link to the piece that I published on museums in the chat, so that if people want to take a look at it and get a sense of the context of kind of struggle around cultural institutions here in the US, you can take a look at it.
Thanks. I actually think and hope that people here are not so well indoctrinated yet, but the conflicts are actually kept alive by some interest groups. So they are kind of blocking wise discussions and solidarity and so on. But that takes a lot of effort actually to keep the conflicts alive, rather than people already having been brainwashed and unable to, in a way, take on new information. This is my reading of the situation. I don't know if it's hopeful thinking or not, but Jussi, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, just on the political issue, that we don't have that kind of like huge divide as in US between the left and right politics, but what we have in Finland, which is kind of like that there has been a constant sliding in the political spectrum towards the right, and stuff that the right-wing parties actually, I mean, the kind of like moderate right-wing parties were writing in the 80s, now seems like it's communistic almost in kind of perspective when you read about that. So there has been a kind of like sliding in the perspective in the political sphere towards the right, and that is causing a lot of issues, trying to push this kind of like state and community based politics on the agenda, because it's all have been sliding towards a more kind of like market based system. Yeah, that's it.
There's also Tere with a raised hand.
Yeah, I have a question for Ashley, but I first just wanted to note on the discussion on colonialism that there has recently been some discussion in Finland between or about the colonialism that Jussi mentioned between the northern areas and the southern areas. It relates most to water power and so on. But what has maybe sort of somehow made the discussion about colonialism and fossil fuels impossible is that it is what Antti mentioned, that the fossil fuels comes from Russia. So and it comes actually many times areas in Siberia where there are Ugric people who are then in the sacrificial zone for that extraction, and that is something that is I don't see that discussed in Finland almost at all, and it's very hard to sort of, for various reasons, and some of those reasons might be good. It might actually be a security risk to start building sort of some sort of solidarity between groups in Finland and Russia and so on. So that's something that has made it very difficult to make that connection. Of course, now a little bit in Europe related to natural gas, that is discussed how much Europe is reliant on Russian natural gas and so on, and there's corruption there also on the European context and so on. But the question I had for you is, I was wondering when you mentioned these bills, proposals for new legislation, how do you work with lawyers? Or is that an important sort of thing, that aspect? Because I was thinking that in Finland, for instance, sort of maybe the legislation, the municipal electricity companies and so on, they are already sort of there. But we don't, I mean, we have the legislation that you are pushing for, but we don't use it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think we still have a long way to go to figure out these questions. I know that they've been debated more in California, where there was a kind of similar effort to create a public entity after the investor-owned utility there was accused of starting some of the terrible wildfires, right? You know, they failed to maintain infrastructure. And, you know, this is a kind of part of our political campaign too, is to point out that investor-owned utilities are returning massive profits to their investors and to their CEOs, and not actually maintaining their infrastructure. And in many cases, you know, they ask for higher charges for consumers, you know, higher charges for ratepayers. in order to update their infrastructure, and then they don't do it. Instead, they give all this money to the investors. So that's part of our criticism. But in the case of California, the question became, well, if we turn the existing investor-owned utility into a publicly owned entity, who will be liable for the homes destroyed and the lives lost as a result of those wildfires? So I mean, that's a kind of extreme version of the question or the situation that you're asking about, Tere, I think. But it really is an issue, and one that I think we need to think about carefully. The people who I know in the campaign for public power here in New York City are many of them connected to NGOs, like organizations fighting for energy democracy, and they're also part of political campaigning groups like the Democratic Socialists of America. As far as I know, there aren't any actual lawyers involved in these campaigns, but I think people are consulting with lawyers and have access to them as a result of being in some of these organizations. And so we really do have to think carefully about what will happen if we win this victory, and essentially are going to be shutting down the investor-owned utilities by virtue of building a public utility. What will happen not just to the workers? How will we guarantee that their pensions will still be in place and that they can be retrained and get new jobs in the renewable energy sector or some other sector? But sort of more broadly speaking, how will we ensure that people who are served by the existing utilities are still served well? So, these are super complicated questions, and I think we're definitely thinking about them. But that most of the mobilization has taken place around getting out the idea that the investor-owned utilities are not just contributing to all of these climate-related disasters, but are actually impeding the transition to sustainability. So that's where a lot of our energy has been. I'm reminded of the moment in the wonderful film by Gillo Pontecorvo, The Battle of Algiers, where the activist with the FLN is talking to one of the people who's fighting to expel the French from Algeria. And he says, it might seem really hard right now, but the battle really gets difficult after you're victorious, right? And I think that's kind of the situation that we're in right now. The obstacles to overcoming Con Ed, which has been around for 100 years, and is this multi-billion-dollar fossil fuel company, seem so insurmountable that all of our attention now is really focused on that struggle. But if we win, then I think we need to be prepared for all these other kinds of very, very thorny questions. I forgot to say something. I don't know if it was in response to Antti or somebody else's question, but one other thing that I should say that we haven't talked about, but which is probably obvious to all of you, nonetheless, it should be mentioned, is that if we're going to be sort of changing people's consciousness, we also need to think about degrowth and, not just taking the existing infrastructures that are based on high consumption of fossil fuels and switching them out and electrifying everything, based on renewable energy. If we just do that, then whatever Green New Deals we manage to win are going to be kind of colonial and are going to rely on exploiting people locally and internationally. So, in New York City, we're very lucky that we have good public transportation systems. So to a certain extent, having a public utility would just build on and be in kind of symbiosis with some of the existing forms of the public sphere and the commons that we already have here in the city. But of course, New York City is very anomalous in relation to other cities in the United States, which are all very sprawling and suburbanized and rely on massive amounts of fossil fuel-based private automobiles. The kinds of struggles that we're pushing also have to help people think about really different futures that rely on wholesale transformation of the infrastructures that have been sold as the American way of life for the last 70 years, right? The construction of the interstate highways and the selling of the automobile was something that really happened during the New Deal. So even if I pointed to the New Deal as an important moment when public power was being advanced, the way it played out ended up not only being highly inegalitarian in racial and gender terms, but also locking in a high consumption fossil fuel model, which of course the US is now exporting to other countries, including countries like China that now emit more carbon than the US in aggregate. So yeah, we really have a big responsibility to shift that perspective. And again, I think that's where environmental humanities and energy humanities are really important, right? Because they can, I think, help people think about alternative futures, help people speculate, and I'm very much interested in speculative fiction, something that we haven't talked about at all here, as a possibility for helping people imagine different worlds. And when I say speculative fictions, I'm thinking, not just about the writing of an author like Kim Stanley Robinson, for instance, whose New York 2140 sort of imagines New York 100 years from now and how it might have been transformed by climate crisis. But I'm also thinking of the work of architects who are trying to imagine a different city through design and what a city might look like. So I have a colleague here in New York named Vanessa Keith, who has a wonderful book called 2100, A Utopian Dystopia. It's available through UR Books, which is based here in New York. And she sort of imagines what cities might look like in 80 years' time, and basically argues for some cities in areas that are not going to be sustainable given current trajectories of carbon emissions and warming having to be pretty much abandoned, a kind of skeleton crew of people left in those cities to dismantle them and take the steel and concrete and other reusable things and move them to cities in zones that are more habitable, including Antarctica. So, whether or not you agree with her proposal, I think she is thinking about really big questions, and they bring up important political issues just beyond design, like who's going to get to move from cities in one country to cities in another part of the planet. So I think these kinds of forms of speculation that environmental humanities can do and that we're seeing in other disciplines, like kind of more experimental branches of design and architecture are really interesting and important.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's important to somehow expand the idea of who gets to talk about these issues, that there is no strict division between science and art and politics and other roles where people can be, or different discourses that people can use when they are talking about these things. But we should be more like flexible in our ways of thinking and discussing these ideas and the potentialities that might be there. I think one of the problems is that we are too divided at the moment, that there are politicians talking about political things and scientists talking about science things, and then artists are doing art and humanities. Well, who cares about the humanities? But we somehow have to learn to talk together about these things.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think it's hugely important. And Carolina, you had mentioned the media before. I think whether or not we like it, the media have adopted a kind of apocalyptic narrative about the climate crisis, and that's been true for many decades. I mean, think back to Mad Max, right? The first film came out of Australia in 1979 or something, and was kind of one of the first versions of an imaginary of climate crisis and breakdown. And the narrative there has almost always been, a complete breakdown of existing infrastructure, and one strong white man who picks up weapons and leads a band of more vulnerable people to some utopia, right? And so it plays into settler colonialism, into patriarchy and racism, the way that the dominant media has narrated what is going to happen. And it takes kind of dissenting texts and environmental humanities perspectives, like for instance, Octavia Butler's parable series, to imagine different protagonists, to imagine more collective forms of flourishing in the present, and to really give us a more hopeful sense of what the possibilities might be, rather than just imagining a kind of, blank slate with one strong individual standing up. I'm going to paste a link to Vanessa Keith's book, 2100, into the chat. So if anybody wants to take a look at it, you'll be able to click on that and find it.
Thanks. I'll at least definitely take a look at it, since we have also been talking about architecture today, so it's very much in our minds, and different ways of visualizing what's ahead of us. It somehow struck me that that you're fighting against these investor-owned utilities and stuck somehow in that battle, but we are, in our consciousness, we are stuck in a different place. I guess we inherited a very different, perhaps better system in that sense, that for instance in Helsinki we have it's not investor-owned, it's city-owned utility, but its organizational form is a company, so it's like publicly owned company which has its own leadership and so on, and it's somehow it's like a bit like a comedy the situation, because the city council actually doesn't really know how to direct the company, and there's like I guess there's little culture that what should you do in this situation, because the company should operate on its own basis, and the kind of the Nordic welfare state model in its current form doesn't really know what to do about that. Like you own it, you could direct it, but should you, and how would that play out, and so on. So they are making a huge profit, and they are they are paying the profit to the city, which is of course somehow like people owned or citizen owned, like the city. So it lowers your taxes, and then through those low taxes you can then pay for the energy company and so on. So it circulates like this, but there's this company kind of a weird kind of like capitalistic practices where you're supposed to get money from customers, but actually they are the citizens, so why should you do it since they own you, and so on. So it's it's very difficult to understand that, like, why is it like this? It doesn't actually make any sense. Why wouldn't we just directly invest in the best possible things that we see that should be done, and do it in a kind of a scientific way and all that? But we are somehow stuck in this weird moment.
Yeah. I'm very sympathetic, although obviously I wish that we had genuine forms of social democracy here in New York and in the United States more broadly, but I understand the challenges. In my book, People's Power, I looked at the situation in Berlin, well, in Germany more broadly, with their energy transition. And then in Berlin, which was the municipal energy authority there had been privatized, as is true for many municipal authorities, water authorities and energy authorities across the EU in the 1990s. And so people were struggling to make it public again, but they were very much aware that some of the dominant parties in the city and across the country, like the Social Democrats, were very much still stuck in an old perspective around fossil fuels and energy transition. And then there were the issues of kind of regulatory capture that I think you were alluding to, Paavo, right? Where you have the regulators who are supposed to be pushing for the public interest, but they're getting some kinds of kickbacks, whether it's money or some kind of ideological support by giving money back to the public that impedes them from really making the appropriate decisions. And so what I find really interesting about the case in Berlin is that they tried to come up with alternative governance structures. And we've been inspired by that work in Berlin and in Hamburg and in many other places around the world. So, we've been thinking about what the public entity would look like in New York, and we don't want it just to have elected people on the governing board. We want to make sure, we want to make sure that other stakeholders can be involved, including labor unions and environmental justice movements, to make sure that environmental justice movements and labor unions and citizen groups actually have representation at the top of the organization. And the other thing that we've thought about doing is to create an observatory, which would be, it's modeled on something that they did in Paris around public water provision. It would basically be a kind of research unit that would be independent from the energy authority, but would be charged with doing research into what it was doing, producing reports that would be critical, if necessary, to make sure that it was functioning, not just to shift quickly in terms towards renewable energy, but to make sure that it wasn't, for instance, cutting poor people off power when they weren't paying their rates. Sorry about the noise.
Yeah, we have to look into those examples. If you have them in the book, I wasn't there yet. I'm half in the middle of it. Anyone have further comments or questions? I think we have already used almost all of our time, or Ashley's time, for this. For us, this has been hugely inspiring. Hopefully we get to continue these kind of dialogues in the future as well, and learn from each other and so forth.
Thank you so much, Paavo, and thank you everyone else for attending, for your great questions, and for all the kind of interesting insights you provided me. It's been really wonderful to engage in this dialogue.
All right, thank you, and have a good day and evening, depending on where you are.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.